Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Clifford Orwin, professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and I studied with Harvey between 1968 and 73 here. And we've decided as a group that since we don't all know one another, we're going to ask people to tell us their names when they speak. And we've also decided that we're going to try to go through the readings in order. That may be somewhat difficult. We're not quite sure exactly what the principle of the different readings is, but let's begin with...
Maybe we should each introduce ourselves.
So
I'll just say I'm Russ Muirhead.
Okay, sorry.
I teach at Dartmouth, just to get the name thing going.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I'm Susan Hamilton. I'm still here.
It's a good place to be.
Yes, I may never leave.
And that's Harvey Mansfield. So shall we begin with liberal democracy as a mixed regime?
Let's begin with that.
All right.
And I'll just start talking to warm things up, if that's all right.
Okay, fine. I was about to do so myself.
Oh, go. No, you go ahead. You'll be more insightful, Cliff. Go.
I thought that this particular chapter was a wonderful example of Harvey's writing. Like so much of what Harvey's written, it's quite difficult. And it combines an extraordinarily nuanced and thought-provoking and thorny analysis of what the mixed regime means in Aristotle, or actually beginning with the difficulties of any notion of mixing at all, and how I was struck very much myself how I'd never given enough thought to what it means to mix, right, until I'd read that article. So you've got this highly theoretical discussion of mixing in Aristotle, and then a discussion of what the early moderns make of mixing and their different principle of it, which is also highly theoretical, there being a great discussion of both body and soul in both of those. And then he goes on to a discussion of liberal democracy as it's practiced today, in which it becomes highly political, perhaps no less theoretical. But then we begin to see all of the identifiable types, of liberal democracy around Harvey's analysis. So, I mean, I was enthralled from the beginning by the notion that liberal democracy, as we know it, mixes liberals and Democrats. I think it's hard for that concept to take off because of the complexity that most people aren't used to that separation. And of course, as you analyze it, liberals include not just liberals, but also conservatives. But in fact, the liberals also think of themselves as Democrats, so they're invisible to themselves and all of these funny twists and turns. But one question that I had about that is the relative, especially if one compares it with Tocqueville's treatment, the relative absence of religion from your account of liberal democracy, and where that would fit in with liberals and Democrats. You make a point of how the liberals, one of the things the great founders of liberal democracy are doing is redefining the soul so as to expel the priests, redefine the soul so the priests can no longer have a hold on it. You don't say much in what follows, though, about the fate of religion in liberal democracy and how it plays into the liberals-Democrats distinction.
Well, let's hear some more while I reflect.
And to build on your comment, Cliff, the account of the liberal democracy that we inhabit as a mixed regime is so intriguing because each of the great parties in Harvey's description, this seems right, is itself stands for a certain kind of mixture. Each party has what he calls liberals, the commercial oligarchs, you might say, in the Republican Party, and the intellectual oligarchs in the Democratic Party, and each of them has a demos, the religious demos in the Republican Party, and the laboring demos in the Democratic Party. Of course, those overlap, but so each one stands for a mixture. And you might think, to interpret, say, the United States as a mixed regime, you might think that the mixture would be represented by parties in a more simple way, that the Conservative Party would be the oligarchic party, and that the Progressive Party would be the Democratic Party. but curiously, each of the two great parties is its own mixture. And that's what makes the account difficult, but also what makes it accurate, and what makes our own regime more mysterious, I think. Why is it that each of our parties are a mixture? Why haven't they divided the way you would think they would if you just mapped Aristotle's account in a more clumsy way onto, say, American politics? Other questions? I'm tempted to almost call on Professor Meltzer because he's the one who taught me about the United States as a mixed regime. And I've been offering that teaching, I think, in an inferior form ever since to my own students. I don't think I have anything to add.
Since the book we're discussing, I guess, was published in 1975, I think, I wonder if 37 years later, the situation is still the same, particularly when the two political parties seem to be less ideologically mixed than they were then.
Harvey, one thing I've always had difficulty with in your writing is
Could you confirm your name is Robert K. Falter?
looking at my identification. I'm old, you know. That's the focus upon choice, such a focus upon choice. And your suggestion that the oligarchy is in a way defined by its emphasis upon choice, as opposed to the Democrats. It always seems to be that both sides choose in a way, and therefore that isn't definite enough. A point that may or may not be connected. You seem to say here that people utter principle, or each side sets forth a principle, what they stand for, only when they go to make a claim. In other words, only when they, as you put it in the earlier discussion, only when somehow they enter politics do they make a claim. And I wonder whether that overlooks the kind of common sense opinions that they tend to have, and that to go back to the previous argument, that isn't just about individuals choosing, but that there are opinions already there.
Well, I would say that a little bit. I think, as Aristotle has it, the oligarchical party is the party of choosing. It's the party of the few, and the few choose to elevate themselves above the many, and that is a definite choice on their part, and they always have it in mind. Whereas the Democrats seem to do just the opposite. They regard themselves as all, or everybody, as a kind of whole. So if you were looking at the regime as a whole, you might want to begin with the Democrats, because they're the ones who are in favor of the whole. But then, as it turns out, each has to borrow from the other, and any regime therefore turns into a kind of mix of mixes, so that the few need to appeal to all, and the all need to somehow include the fact that some people are better than others, or some choices are better than others. So choice matters. And so part of this principle, a mix or principle, is that the assertion of choice coupled with a need for a whole, so that you both make a choice and then, in a way, rise above that choice, because you're saying that it isn't enough just to have a few in charge. They also have to rule for the common good. So there must be that.
Those of those who have come from a certain family or class, they already have a kind of opinion of a certain superiority, or those who just by their activities realize, have some grasp of it, that the focus upon choice as such seems to be somewhat abstract.
Well, that's modern politics for you. It's somewhat abstract. So what happens in modern parties is you say that the few become divided. This is I think a consequence of the religious question, the way in which it is treated. The few are divided into the intellectuals, or you might say the former priests, and the men of property, the former rich, and so that then leads to this kind of complicated class warfare between no longer just the few and the many, but as Russ was saying, different combinations of the few and the many.
Jean Yarbrough. Harvey, I wanted to ask you something that you wrote on the first page of this essay, which I think speaks to a lot of the people whom you've studied. You say of the Democrats that they are ordinary voters. What they want is competence, no less than what most people have, but no more. They want this with security, more for the sake of their dignity than for any level of comfort, more against injustice than against loss. They prefer a quiet, private life and are satisfied with the praise and esteem of their friends. That sounds like what Aristotle says in the Politics, that the poor don't really want to be involved in politics, but they have to go into it for the sake of self-defense. It sounds like Machiavelli with the two humors that divide the few and the many. But then you have Tocqueville. And this sounds to me like what Tocqueville is describing as individualism. And to link that up with what Linda was asking in the last session, we now have so many independents, people who are disgusted with politics. What is the nature of the body politic? Okay.
Jim Stoner at LSU. Two responses to the initial questions that Cliff Orwin and Russ Muir had put. On the question of the religious question and what happens to it, it occurs to me that in Great Britain and the United States, there seem to be opposite religious settlements. In Great Britain, establishment. In the United States, no establishment. Is that the same thing, establishment and no establishment, in terms of the settlement? And it occurs to me that maybe it isn't, because no establishment might mean that religion is floating around out there and can always interject itself into the parties and into partisan disputes. And that relates to what was going to be my response to Russ Muirhead's point, which is that we once had the oligarchic parties. We had the Federalists, and that didn't work. And then the Whigs, and that didn't work. And then the Republicans came along, right? And so somehow they are the successors to the Federalists and the Whigs, but they're different. They're different because they explicitly founded themselves on a moral principle, citing that old Democrat, Thomas Jefferson, right, and the Declaration of Independence. But also because they were able to incorporate the abolitionists, no small part of which, of whom were animated by a kind of religious principle. And if you think of the different waves of republicanism, from prohibition to pro-life politics today, there's been a kind of religious element to it. So I wonder if, in some way or another, this particular character of the American mixing is related to the question of what happens to religion in this liberal democracy, where the religious settlement maybe isn't a final settlement.
With that free-floating character reflects the fact that we do have religious liberals, that is to say, entrepreneurs of religion, who are a very distinct subsection of the liberal class. They're very successful and effective in their life. And so that they're taking the flocks with them, as it were.
Yeah, that's good. So,
Yeah, Andy Sable.
Andy Sabo from UCLA. I don't have a response to that, although someone who teaches in Southern California, the Center of Religious Entrepreneurship, maybe I could. I had a question about, Harvey, about something you wrote on page 10 here, and I'm wondering if it's changed. Towards the bottom, you write, the rich are allowed to remain rich, rather encouraged to become even richer if they turn private life into a privatized society. Their ostentation is more or less confined to certain exclusive neighborhoods and country clubs. It is not directly political and not obvious in the halls of power. Now that doesn't seem to describe the way wealth works in society now, but just not to be special pleading, the oligarchs in the other party, the cultural elites, also seem to be more self-assertive and probably more offensive to certain parts of the demos than they were when you wrote this. I mean, there might have been certain people in Greenwich Village who looked down on Mid-America, back then, but now there's, large sets of self-described cultural elites, sometimes, or described by both sides, cultural elites, or smart people who, talk about flyover territory and who feel threatened by the demos and express their sense of threat in ways that are offensive and can be drawn on by the other party. So I think this essay was partly as a call for liberals to develop a certain partisan consciousness, to realize that they're not Democrats and maybe appreciate each other more. But I wonder if the corrective now might need to be the other way, and maybe an answer to Gene Yarborough's question, maybe the reason that so many of the demos are alienated is that the oligarchs have put themselves forward in the wrong way, or have been offensive in their rhetoric. Would you agree with that at all? Or?
Yes, I find something to agree in that, yeah.
My question is poorly posed. Do you mostly agree with it? Is what
Religion doesn't seem to have disappeared from our politics as it should have done. But it is both stayed around and moderated the kind of rational or scientific democracy we might have had, and at the same time been transformed itself into something much more democratic and assertive and principled. So I think it is still there, and it's striking that that there are amongst these liberals priests or democratic priests who are capable of moving democratic multitudes. And this is certainly a feature of our politics now. Yeah.
Ralph Hancock, Brigham Young University. So further on Andy's remark about how the certain liberals or intellectuals stand with respect to the demos today, is it still the case that the intellectual part of the liberals see themselves as more democratic than the people? They're in favor of being more rational. Do they still see themselves as also as being more democratic? This brilliant essay of Professor Mansfield's was probably the first thing I read of his, since it was maybe brand new about the time I became his student. And I've always I've never stopped thinking about and trying to make use of these remarks of his on the last couple of pages about liberals having become invisible to themselves. I think that still gets to the heart of the problem that central problem that American politics faces. The bearing of this on the religious question, or the bearing of the religious question on this problem has a dimension that I think is brought out on page 7 and something that I'm not sure I would have known how to notice when I first read this. Just above the last paragraph that begins on page 7, that many Democrats are poor, but since poverty is a mere lack, they cannot advance a claim to rule because they are poor. Poverty is nothing to be proud of. A position that seemed obvious in the ancient world, I suppose, but is this not exactly what is put into question by Christianity, and which helps to account for the invisibility to themselves of the modern intellectual liberal party, who want to be more democratic than the people and who in a way stand for the dignity of a mere lack that cannot be gained and therefore that has no limits. Another side of the religious question.
Nathan Tarkov. Two things that I won't even pretend are related. One, just listening to what Ralph Hancock just said, reminds me that on the one hand, we heard the President of the United States say that his basic socioeconomic stance to protect the poor and needy is derived from the gospel. And on the other hand, a Republican presidential candidate, Senator Santorum, say this was a phony theology and that his politics are derived from the gospel. So the religious issue seems to be very much with us. The other completely unrelated point, listening again to the passage at the beginning that Jean Yarbrough read to me, I thought, and I may entirely misunderstand Harvey's intention there, that the description of the demos who prefer a quiet private life and are satisfied with the praise and esteem of their friends sounds suspiciously like the philosophers as Aristotle describes them in the beginning of Book 7, or say as Plato's Socrates speaks of them in Book 6 of the Republic. In that sense, the philosophers seem, in a way, to have at least as much in common with the demos as with the intellectual oligarchy. I'm not sure I noticed that in 1975 when I read it the first time.
Philosophers have in common with the liberals, in quotes, is the disputability of things. And what they have in common with the demos is the desire for quiet dispute among oneself, perhaps even in one's own mind.
College. I was very struck by, I think it seems to me one of the themes in Harvey's work is this complicated relationship between philosophy and political science understood in the classic Aristotelian sense of the term. There's a very beautiful passage on page 5 of Liberal Democracy as a New Regime where Harvey writes that the philosopher has to become a political scientist for his own sake as well as for the benefit of the community, to make his virtue, his intellectual virtue, visible. And he tries to become visible in the mixed regime. This would be interesting to hear you talk. It seems to me that against those who emphasize the essentially apologetic character of the philosophical life, the philosopher simply wanting to lead a private life or to defend the philosophical life against challengers, a more apolitical conception of philosophy. It seems to me in many of these readings, there's an emphasis on the need for the philosopher to become a political scientist. And not only for the sake of the community, but you say for his own sake, for the sake of his own understanding or the understanding of the truth of things. So it seems to me there's a partial correction of a tendency within Straussianism, if I could put it that way there. So I'd be interested to hear if you could say a word about that.
There's a good bit about the body and the soul in this essay.
That's right.
Yeah. Has been mentioned really, except by Gene Yarborough's book of body politic. I think for the ancients, in order for there to be common good, there must be a soul. There isn't a body politic. It's a city or a country is made up of people with bodies, but they can't get together merely on that basis. There needs to be some soul to support the idea that there's a possibility of a common good that would allow you to rise above the separability, individuality of each person's body. So when the moderns come, and they're the ones who start speaking of the body politic. In Hobbes, a legal body, and so the city or the country becomes, society becomes a body through a legal representation, or then later on you get in Montesquieu legislative body and judicial body, and this is in the Federalists too. So that those sort of soulful organizations are understood differently, as if there could be a body made of bodies, and it didn't have the difficulties or troubles of a soul in collecting bodies. Say the legislative body is made a body by its willingness or powers to defend itself. So that you got this sort of appeal to a spiritedness within the Constitution. That, but that spiritedness is really a characteristic of the soul, and not of body as such. It's characteristic of the human body, the way in which we react and we dispute. We are recalcitrant, all those things. So I think I said somewhere in this essay that moral virtue is a virtue of the body which is treated as a soul. So do you make we need moral virtues, and we need a politics of the soul in order to bring us together. We need that, but the only way to do it is to understand or treat the body as if it were really a soul and had a kind of tameness or tameability of a soul. So we wouldn't have moral virtues if we didn't have bodies, but we can only have moral virtues through looking on those bodies as if they were parts of a soul.
Soul. I'm wondering how strong
conservatism, modern conservatism, is after the religious settlement, or if conservatism expresses doubts about progress, the sort of progress the progressives are for, isn't it true that politically the doubts become stronger or seem to need the strength of religion or an older sort of conservatism often? Isn't it true in politics that we often, to stand up for principle, find it at least convenient to make alliances with religion? So does the new conservatism depend on an older sort, the sort that Catherine was mentioning earlier? You might say, no, it can depend on property, but that's changed too, because it's not the property of land, which has a real conservatism about it, but that property can be democratized too, can become finance, and so that would be another reason why the modern conservative seems to rely on the older sort of side.
But I suppose the question is the older sort simply older, or is it a permanent aspect of the human condition to have some sensible doubt about rational control or about progress, in which case it can happen to be older somewhat chronologically, though, as has been pointed out, it's not so clear in the American case it is that old. Some of the religious sentiments that modern conservatism depends on are not particularly, are newer. I mean, this is, they've been reborn, you might say, to use an appropriate term, in America, so.
It's the religious character, not the oldness.
Right. Mitt Romney to take his religion isn't that old. I mean, but maybe it would still lead to a certain, doubt about a certain kind of liberalism.
I hope it'd be appropriate to change to the spirit, the soul of the Constitution book, because the essay on political science of the Constitution, I think, is really brilliant because it challenges people who have been told that they're institutionalists to define and defend them. And I think you make the unfortunately accurate claim that behavioralism triumphs because institutionalists really didn't have a defense, didn't have anything to say. You try to explain what is behind institutionalism as related to the purposes that lie behind the institutional forms. But I've always been curious to what, teaching Tocqueville, I'm always struck by how institutions play such a small role in democracy in America. That there's no founding, there's just a point of departure. Mores are more important than the laws, and when he talks about the Constitution, it's mainly federalism, which was embodied practices that had already been established. So I was wondering how you could say something about your defense of institutionalism and institutional forms on the one hand, and your praise of Tocqueville. He doesn't seem to pay as much attention to that.
I think that's a good observation that there isn't in Tocqueville this ambition counteracting ambition. It's more perhaps ambition building on ambition. But the ambition which is the petty ambition that is exploited and improved in township government. But at the base of the American system is a practice of political liberty that keeps us recalcitrant, to some extent ignorant, attached to locality, impressed with ourselves, and so less dependent on the elites on which the Federalist seems to rely for our political health. The elites, which are given opportunity by the Constitution and its institutionalization of debate and defense and contention. Yeah, so there's something of the contentiousness of American politics is not there in Tocqueville. It may be just that he wanted to emphasize so much the base of political liberty, and which is the natural, spontaneous connection of American politics to human nature, rather than the Constitution, which is a work of art. Based on not just a theory, but rival theories. So it's a kind of mixture of theories. That's an interesting thought of his. So to speak, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are in the Constitution. I think so. I think you're right that there is why he does that. Well, I think maybe just to in order to praise with little or no qualification the actual practices and exercises of political liberty.
On this question of the few and the many, it seems to me there's been a fundamental shift in modern times, and even in the 37 years since Harvey wrote this essay on left and right. The left pioneered democracy, you might say. The workers organized, the trade unions pushed for wider suffrage and so on, and the conservatives responded often as amateurs who would have preferred a quiet life, but had to cope with the rise of working class politics. And the left was democratic. The right had to be sometimes coaxed into democracy. But today the left is in favor of expertise, technocratic solutions, as was mentioned earlier this morning. And our president said to his staff last year that he envied Hu Jintao of China, because Hu doesn't have to have this messy business of elections. And his remark to Medvedev maybe is in the same spirit, that you don't have flexibility if you have to do what the voters want. This is all unrecognizable to the historic left. And in particular, and I'd be interested if Harvey has a comment here, we now, since the McGovern-Nixon election, have the whole question of transnationalism with the few and the many. So the Brussels for the Europeans and the international courts and the UN bodies, these look like the few, and the many are left behind as the voters in the democracies. So where's the oligarchy? Is it now an international oligarchy that looms upon us?
You might say always was. And now it's become more pronounced with the discrediting of nations and nationalism. I don't have a big remark on that. I will say that one of the main points is not conventional. That is the importance of forms in the study of politics. I'd say. I'll bring that out in his writings. There's two words in the preface to America's Constitutional Soul. Forms matter. So work out the difference between the importance of forms, which is, I think, the question which lies behind behavioralism versus institutional science. institutions are some kind of form, but they somehow not complete or understood as such. And that's how the institutional political scientists were able to be sort of taken from their flank by the behavioralists who wanted to always to emphasize the informal.
And the institutions aren't complete forms because they don't, they can't provide their own, they don't explain themselves. They
That's
don't have
right,
the reasons.
They don't explain and therefore don't defend themselves,
Yeah. And the reasons that do explain them can't actually get a hearing or can't be unveiled. They can't be part of our civic education because they're offensive to democracy.
Yeah. In the living Constitution, I mean, who defends the integrity of the three branches? It's just whatever can be done most conveniently right now. And if and all you need is empathy, no spiritedness, no defense, therefore no ambition, just concealed ambition.
Issue of forms connects to Shep's question also, that why did Tocqueville emphasize forms and respect for forms so much? It seems to me one of the reasons, the thing that's important about forms for Tocqueville is that Americans have the habit of respecting them. So it's the self-restraint that the respect for forms shows that's important for him, not that the forms channel things and produce certain results, but that they're an opportunity for the exercise of self-restraint, and they show the habit of self-restraint that he seems to think is the most important, that I think he thinks is the most important thing for the success of democracy. So I think the thing would be that laws can't succeed if the mores go south. But with good mores, there's a lot of room in the laws, and I take institutions to be, in effect, laws. So his concern is so much for the effect of democracy on the human soul, that institutions are sort of secondary, and that the founders just didn't think so much about the effect of democracy on the human soul.
I'm Ben Berger at Swarthmore College. Sorry, I just want to knit together a couple of things that, because all the books are in play now, it seemed, that we were discussing from this session. We've touched upon, at least in Tocqueville and all of them. And so at the end of the selection from The Spirit of Liberalism, you write about true liberals need to be more leaders, more ambition, more vocal. But Andy was earlier saying that it seems like there are people in both camps, both in the business and in the intellectual or cultural elite camp, that are being quite vocal, and yet it doesn't seem like we're on our way to utopia. And so maybe what's missing then is the part that you were writing about in the Tocqueville selection, which is not just speaking up, but speaking up for greatness, something, the content, the quality of what's being vocalized, and that if it's simply pettiness that's being vocalized or a petty ambition, then that's not really so good. But the closing question I have for you is then, I really like that you play up Tocqueville's despair towards the end, and his sense that you're damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. Because if you don't allow greatness to speak up well, then you just kind of go into this base materialism and perhaps make way for democratic soft despotism or a harsh one. But if you do, it may become overweening, and you may desire to impose this greatness on others, and that carries its own risks. So are we damned if we do or damned if we don't?
Yes.
Do you mostly agree?
Yes, is right. Ours is a country with ambition, so I don't think it's really a choice that we have. Greatness or pettiness, but and pettiness is not all. I mean, is not all that attractive. And it's that in order to achieve pettiness, you have to suppress greatness. It takes a positive effort, and I think that. Therefore, that's not the way to go. I will make a remark about the forms again, and the importance of the forms. In America, I think you have these two quite contrary ways of thinking, or of things that we're known for. We're known for being pragmatic and impatient, and we're the can-do country. That's a great advantage to informality. You look for the most convenient way to do something, and it's also maybe the cheapest way, and we're good at that. But on the other hand, we also are the country of due process, of lawyerliness, of rights understood as giving protection and integrity to each of our choices, that you mustn't step all over me while you're doing what you can do. So I think we struggle with this opposition between two of our favorite characteristics, I would say.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
okay. I'm Janet Doherty. At the end of Liberal Democracy, the Mixed Regime, and at the end of the introduction to America's Constitutional Soul, Harvey, you call for self-knowledge, and it seems to me you provide the basis for self-knowledge. Presumably, politicians should read these things, and liberals and Democrats should read these things and recognize themselves, recognize that they're ambitious and want, I take it, to be distinguished from demagogues. But it seems to me, I guess I'm a bit at a loss as to how that becomes visible through these things, through these readings, without the reverence for the Constitution, without formalities that have more integrity than I think. I mean, even though you referred to law just now, but there are so many laws, and everyone knows that a good lawyer can manipulate them, can use them. Yeah, it slows things down, but all it does is give an advantage to the experts. It's not. They don't really make the distinction between demagoguery and statesmanship visible. They don't make virtue visible, unless virtue is technical expertise. And I mean, I'm sorry, maybe connecting too many things all at once, but it seems to me maybe what Tocqueville saw the people forming themselves into a body. I thought maybe that was a way that something other than body is visible, because it's something that people can do. They can form themselves and then accomplish something. But that too seems rare. And the PTA, I mean, soccer fields, they're not, it doesn't seem to me very impressive. So I just wonder whether the mixedness that is characteristic of our particular form of government hasn't succeeded too much in concealing assertiveness. that you talk about how in a liberal democracy the mixing principle doesn't make virtue visible. The liberal democracy therefore has a dual advantage over this is page 15. A dual advantage over the ancient mixed regime of a more democratic appearance and a more oligarchic reality. The results should please both parties. But the trouble is that liberal oligarchs have been taken in by the appearance more than the Democrats. So it should please both parties. It should be more effectual. It should work better and be more permanent. But it's more self-concealing. And without that visibility, how can it be successful?
Don't underestimate the PTA. There is a touch of greatness in it.
Trying to convince myself of that.
From the Cambridge Historical Commission, unelected body of self-appointed experts. Look, everything has to be done always at present. You can't lean on your past successes, your laurels. You have to make it go for the present generation. It's not a constitution we have is not one that is a mechanism that works without human intervention and spirit behind it.
Reading these pieces makes me relatively sanguine over those words about this condition of the American Republic, that the mixture doesn't seem to be decaying into a especially one-sided regime. Both sets of elites assert themselves, and although they can't, one set still can't understand itself as elite, but the point remains. Can't explain itself to the people as a mixed regime, and yet it seems stabilized as a mixed regime, and the vitality of our partisan contest suggests that the defense of partisanship maybe doesn't really need to be offered. People don't really accept the respectability of party, but they act as if they do. They have a vital contest, unlike Europe, and so maybe the end is near because I'm feeling quite sanguine.
Except when one turns to the universities. And then there we don't have the respectability of party, but we have a insufferable domination of political correctness.
Well, I guess Ralph was first.
I'll reply to that. Under Bob? Ralph. Sorry.
Go ahead, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
No. I just want to reply to Andy's very interesting remark, which others have made also, about the character of the elites and the difficulties. In other words, on the right, one seems kind of somewhat crazy libertarian, and on the left, a somewhat crazy, let's call it counterculturalism. It seems to me one of the great things that Harvey has contributed to us is an encouragement for us to be thoughtful about what it takes to sustain such an order, and therefore, and that takes to some extent a clear understanding of those prerequisites in modern conditions, and that's the kind of that you've brought to many of us. Just one particular, and that is the way you've encouraged conservatives to take responsibility for the preservation, as much as possible, of this great liberal regime.
I know it's late, but
we really 5 minutes.
a very brief, probably elliptical suggestion about something brilliant and elliptical by which Harvey concludes the Tocqueville chapter namely this profound discussion of greatness, the relation of Tocqueville's greatness to moral virtue, really the distinction between the two. And it strikes me that there might be help here in discerning the question that had arisen earlier regarding the relationship of partisanship to the religious question. When we notice that, as Harvey says, greatness is not in nature, I think we have to say that there has to be a connection between Tocqueville's understanding, his somewhat elusive understanding of greatness, and Tocqueville's troubled Christianity. Notice that greatness is in a way, it's not in nature, it's not like virtue in that sense, it's in a way higher than nature, in a way lower in its democratic diversity. So it seems to me that we could connect Tocqueville's figure of greatness as, in a way, the only sort of anchor there is to his democratic responsibility, precisely with a certain non-settlement of the religious question. That would be my suggestion.
Nathan? Well, at the risk of emphasizing the obvious, in 1975-78, the spirit of liberalism, Harvey Mansfield presented himself as a defender and friend of liberalism, though he admits in the preface to the book that's not the same as being a liberal, and defender of, especially of spirited liberalism. In the 1980s, in the essays collected in America's Constitutional Soul, he presents himself as a defender or friend of constitutional conservatism, which I infer, although he doesn't say so explicitly as he did in the other book, is not the same as being a conservative. I assume that, like Tocqueville, he tries to see further than both parties, but I do wonder whether there is not a change from the 70s to the 80s indicated by those two different projects, or whether he just did liberalism first.
That was maybe Ronald Reagan. Influence of Reagan seemed to be a conservative way of reasserting truths that liberals had failed to defend.
Okay, fine. Thanks to all.
We got lunch.